historical kiln in Queenston Heights. Welcome to historical Queenston Heights. I love Niagara.
I have a question for you. What do you know about Niagara?
It has a really big falls.
I have a question for you. Do you like history?
So let me ask you, is that a rhetorical question?
Niagara, it's more than just the falls. It's rich in history and wine.
Okay, so we were talking about the more obscure places in Niagara. Some of the coolest history is not even in Niagara Falls.
Historical Niagara rocks!
What else do you have to say for yourself?
Good morning, I'm Donald, and I'm all about history.
And I'm all about the base. The base. If you're born, raised, or visit Niagara, you're always from Niagara. One of the greatest places on Earth. Welcome to Queenston Heights, one of Canada's most historical places. Of course, a lot of people know about the famous War of 1812, Sir Isaac Brock, and Brock's Monument, which is down the road, which we'll get to shortly in the show. But did you know that Queenston Heights, St. David's, Upper Niagara on Lake, boasts one of the most famous kilns in all of Canada, and also the Usher Mines and the famous old railroad station / tracks that used to go all the way down York Road. Sit back, relax, and listen as the experts share their tidbits of information on historical Queenston Heights.
The War of 1812 is a very important part of the Niagara region history, of course. Niagara-on-the-Lake was the British headquarters for the British Army during the War of 1812, and Queenston in particular played a very important role in the fact that it was the first site where the American soldiers landed and attacked British soil on October 13th, 1812, with Brock. There's of course the big story of Major General Isaac Brock, who was in charge of the area. He anticipated that the Americans would attack the soil up in Niagara-on-the-Lake, but they surprised the British Army by attacking down at Queenston. And so Brock hears word that they have landed at Queenston Heights, and he races down to Queenston on horseback and leads the first charge up to Queenston Heights, and unfortunately is shot, as well as his aide-de-camp, Captain MacDonnell, that gets shot down. But of course, afterwards, it's General Sheaffe and the First Nations who do a second round of attack on the Americans and end up eventually winning the Battle of Queenston Heights. They take hundreds of US soldiers captive as prisoners of war and march them back to Fort George. But the sad part, of course, of the story is that Major General Isaac Brock died.
Many years ago, William Kirby was a resident of Niagara-on-the-Lake and a member of the congregation of St. Mark's. William Kirby was a historian and a novelist. He wrote a very famous book called The Golden Dog, which takes place in Quebec. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. He also wrote several books on the history of Niagara-on-the-Lake. Now, William Kirby knew this boulder because it sat somewhere down there by the mouth of the Niagara River, kind of facing Fort Niagara. And William Kirby knew the tale that Brock used to sit on this rock and look over at Fort Niagara, contemplating what the Americans might or might not do. Fast forward 50 years, and William Kirby thought, well, that stone should be preserved along with the story. So he had the stone removed here to the cemetery of St. Mark's. And you can kind of see that it would be comfortable and pleasant to sit on. Whether Brock sat it or not, it's William Kirby's idea. In 2011, the choir from Guernsey, which is the home island of Isaac Brock, was here giving a concert. And so we installed this stone, which tells the story of this boulder and William Kirby, and the stone which is called Brock's Seat.
Now his story is really unique in that he dies in Queenston. He's taken back and he lays in state in the town of Niagara on the lake. He's later buried in one of the bastions at Fort George. And in the 1820s, they build the first Brock monument, and he and MacDonnell are buried underneath. But that monument eventually gets bombed by Benjamin Lett, who is against the British rule, and he bombs it. So they decide to remove Brock and MacDonnell temporarily from the tomb. They bury him in the Hamilton Cemetery in Queenston Heights. And then when the second Brock monument, the one that you see now, is built, they move Brock and MacDonnell back over to Queenston Heights underneath the monument. So Brock has actually been buried about 4 times, and the museum has his hat actually, and it's one of our most prized possessions. Now the funny story, we call it General Brock's hat, but General Brock never actually wore it. He ordered it to match his rank as the Major General, but it didn't arrive until just after the Battle of Queenston Heights.
Brock became a hero in death, and important in death, as proclaimed the savior of Canada.
Well, poor General Brock died here on the Heights on October 13th, 1812, but probably for one of the first times in our history, different people of different backgrounds and different races came together to fight for a common cause.
Most Canadians have heard of this heroine behind me, Laura Secord. Unfortunately, most people associate her with chocolate. But Laura Secord was more than just chocolate. She's a great part of Canadian history. But hey, I kind of like the chocolate part.
Laura Secord is a controversial person, actually, I would say, in War of 1812 history as it relates to Queenston. Of course, she was a resident of Queenston Heights, not Queenston Heights, of Queenston itself, the town. And Laura Secord is known for her act of bravery during the War of 1812, when her house was actually billeted by American soldiers. So they were living in her home. She was forced to feed them and to look after them and such. Her husband is actually as well upstairs. He was wounded in the Battle of Queenston Heights. He was in the house as well. So he was recouping from that. And they overheard the soldiers talking about a plan of attack against the British Army with Fitzgibbon at Beaver Dams. So Laura decides very early one morning to head out of her home and head towards the British encampment and warn them of the American soldiers who will be planning a surprise attack on them. Now Laura Secord, she does make it there, apparently with some help as well from First Nations groups, and warns Fitzgibbon about what is going to happen. Now there's some controversy. I said she's a bit controversial because there are some reports that the First Nations group had already warned Fitzgibbon about the impending attack, but either way, it was a confirmation for Fitzgibbon that this attack was coming, and they were prepared to attack back to the American soldiers. And so they actually ended up winning that battle and surprising the Americans themselves. But Laura Secord stays pretty quiet about what she did after the War of 1812 because she had a lot of relations with the United States, of course, living by Queenston. There's a lot of cross-border relations that way. So she's very quiet, and she remains quiet until about the 1860s when the Prince Regent comes to visit Queenston Heights. And at the time, Laura Secord is in need of funds and such. So she petitions, asks to speak to the Prince and requests some financial compensation for what she contributed to the War of 1812 as a domestic helper in that way, a hero as such. And he decides to go home. He talks to Mummy, and she actually does get financial compensation for her work. And at that time is when her story comes out publicly and becomes more important. Now, she really becomes quite popular more in the 1900s around the commemoration, the 100th anniversary of the War of 1812. And that's when you see the Laura Secord chocolate store start up, and they hear about the story of Laura Secord, and they decide to grab onto that story and associate it with their chocolate company.
The railway initially was built to travel, most of the transportation was by lake, from lake to lake, and the early railways were designed to carry traffic between the port and port. So the first one ran from, I believe it ran from Niagara on the lake, and it ran up to somewhere north of the falls.
The Queenston Chippewa Railway, probably the oldest railway in what's now Ontario. And in 1831, the company was formed to build a railroad that would hopefully go the length of the Niagara River. But the most important bit, the first bit, went from Queenston to Chippewa.
And then reloaded onto other ships there and continue on into Lake Erie. What then happened is the Hamilton brothers petitioned for what was a railway system of sorts. Now, not as we know it today, the very first one, it was the Erie and Ontario Railway. And it was actually a horse-drawn railway system. So people who wanted to travel from Queenston to Chippewa or into Niagara Falls would actually load into the rail car, which would then be pulled by several horses, of course, to get up the escarpment because it was quite heavy, and then all of the baggage would be up on top of the car.
But eventually it hauled people, and by 1854, instead of horses, a steam locomotive would take people from the docks down there to view Niagara Falls or make it all the way to Chippewa.
There was a period after the first steam trains came in, when it was developed as more of a public transportation system, and you started to see the local radial railways in. The electric railways came for the electrical power that came from the Niagara Falls. So those were a separate breed, and they sort of ran between the turn of the century up till about 1930, and at that point they gave way to the car and one thing or another.
We have remnants of the old railways here in Niagara-on-the-Lake. As a matter of fact, what we're doing with one of the most significant belt lines is we're creating the Upper Canada Heritage Trail and actually bringing it into shape that's usable for leisure. It'll be a big trail that goes all the way from the waterfront all the way to the escarpment, which will connect two of our communities or three of our communities in another way. Instead of by car, it will be through bicycles, walking, it will be with horse riding, and people will be able to connect with Queenston, St. David's, and into the Old Town. We're very proud that we're going to be declaring it, I'm hopeful that we'll be declaring it heritage, and it will be recognized and by the provincial government, by the federal government, as being a significant trail for our community.
So Queenston's history in relation to the water is, of course, very important. It was a spot along the ferry service with the Canada steamship lines, the Secord and the Cayuga, the Corona and such, where travelers used to come to Queenston and then could travel throughout Niagara or head into Niagara Falls. They could go into Niagara-on-the-Lake or enjoy Queenston themselves. There's actually stories of young boys who used to be at the docks, and they would either jump off the docks and go swimming for the coins that the guests on the ships would throw down at them. Or actually, one of our members had a reminiscence about boys being in the nude on the beaches and having to cover themselves up or not.
Earliest and fondest memories is going down to Queenston Heights especially the Queenston docks in the early 50s, there was a run of silver bass that was known to everyone. And it was an event that everyone looked forward to. And my relatives on the U.S. side of the border would come across to our house at the corner of Arthur and Stanley, pick me up. I was just a little kid, and we would go down there. And you could barely find a parking spot. And Queenston Dock, from one end to the other, would be shoulder-to-shoulder fishermen, throwing their lines out, sometimes with 2 and 3 hooks on, and reeling in silver bass by the bushelful. As a matter of fact, my uncle used to bring a peach basket, and we would fill the peach basket with silver bass, go home, clean them, eat them, and whatever was left over, he brought back home. He worked for a trucking firm in Niagara Falls, New York. They were all fishermen, and for those who couldn't make that day of fishing, he would feed them the next day.
So there was a strong ferry service in between Lewiston and Queenston, and in terms of Black history, actually, it is said that a few slaves would hide on the ferries in order to cross into Canada. So there are a few stories of that. But one of the interesting things about the ferry service in relation to Queenston is Queenston has one of the oldest post offices in Canada in 1801, and the ferry service was very important because it became the center for mail going across to the United States or coming from the United States into Canada because of that ferry service. So the post office has a very long history, and in relation to the ferry service in terms of history here in Canada.
Okay, folks, it's trivia time. How well do you know your Queenston Heights trivia?
In what century was Queenston created? A, the 1600s, B, the 1700s, or C, the 1800s?
Queenston was first settled in the 1770s by Loyalist refugees and American immigrants.
In 1812, Sir Isaac Brock was killed in Queenston.
Kilns are all built into the side of the escarpment, not far from Queenston Heights here. Used to be 6 kilns. You can go for a hike along the Bruce Trail, a part of UNESCO World Biosphere, and you can still see 5 of the 6 cement kilns. And a fella named Isaac Usher, starting in the 1880s, started basically mining this stone and using the kilns to create this cement. And unlike Portland cement, it takes a lot longer to cure or to dry, but it is incredibly tough stuff. And the company did well for a few decades, but it's not practical as building material because of the length of time it took to dry. And then the opposite problem is once you make anything out of this stuff, it's virtually indestructible.
It was built between 1834 and 1836 by John Lapshaw, that was the architect, and it was for the Hamilton family. So basically, it was built as a sort of statement of wealth, a sort of Greek revival, massive white mansion rising out of the Canadian wilderness, which was what people still thought of this place as at the time. And there would have been a lot more trees and a lot more shrubs around here to make it look sort of even more like stunning as you came up the hill. And yeah, so it was built as a family home. Hamilton and his wife Hannah had 11 kids at the time. Well, actually, he died while the 11th was still not born yet, so that was actually really tragic. He died in 1839. So then it was Hannah and her 11 kids and her mother living here. So still a pretty big house for that many people to take care of with 11 kids, so yeah.
Alexander was rather revolutionary in those days. He thought he was not going to have open fireplaces. That just wasted heat. So he contracted with Whedon Company, Buffalo, for 4 Franklin-type stoves with a double baffle so that you had a second chance at the heat, which he implanted between the walls 4 places in the building. So that was quite interesting.
I think to Queenston, Willowbank represents like a really important, iconic monument to Queenston's history. So this became a school, basically. Julian Smith, the architect, famous Canadian architect, he decided that this would be the perfect place, and he basically spearheaded the movement for it to be a school of restoration arts. So his idea was that this is such an inspiring backdrop to train the next generation of conservation, like heritage professionals, so tradespeople, heritage consultants, the whole variety. So yeah, and it is. So we've adaptively reused the house and Laura Secord School to be a school to do exactly that. So yeah.
The cemetery is a private cemetery, the Hamilton Cemetery. Probably the first burial was about early 1800, and that is a separate area with a stone, and they have their trustees. There's only one trustee now. They have cremation burials by members of the family now.
The natural heritage as well as the built heritage is super important to Willowbank. I mean, this is like the estate has been occupied for about 8,000 years. The portage route that starts at the base of the ravine and goes up through was the main portage route to get around the falls, basically until you could go down the canal or drive. And the neutrals, indigenous people, inhabited this place for thousands of years before white people came. So yeah, to me that's extremely interesting, and it's just as important as like the build history that we have here, to understand that that all came before. So
we have the powwow here, and the Aboriginals come along and plant a garden behind the work barn. So they're very keen to come along, and during the planting of the sort of a ceremonial planting, they came, I think the Mohawk people came along and planted one of the trees, which was nice. I think one thing that's important about why this has managed to still exist is because it was in one family and their cousins for 100 years. John Bright and Dorothy Bright only bought it in 1934. And this is one of the reasons I think these stately homes can survive.
In 1981, I broke a story with the St. Catharines Standard about a man being buried in his yard. Nobody in the province was allowed to be buried in their yard, but this was no ordinary man. Samuel Weir, QC, a controversial lawyer descended from pioneer stock with roots in Ireland and Germany, a bencher in the Law Society of Upper Canada. Weir made a backroom deal with the higher-ups of the provincial government. Some say it was right at the top, Premier Bill Davis. If they allowed him to be buried at home, he would leave his extraordinary collection of more than 1,000 works of art and sculpture to the people of Niagara. And so it came to pass. Today, his home has been turned into an art gallery and library, Riverbrink, near the banks of the lower Niagara River at Queenston. And of course, Sam continues to watch over his property from his final resting place, near the entrance to the Georgian-style house. Riverbrink is open all year round, and Sam, yes, you can rest in peace.
Okay, I'm standing here in the living room of Riverbrink Art Museum, the former home of Sam Weir, a lawyer from London, Ontario. And I'm standing in front of a painting by Charmaine Lurch, part of the exhibition that we have on now called Compounding Vision. And this is a work by this contemporary artist, but it does continue the tradition and the work that Sam Weir started here when he left his home and the art collection to start a public art museum upon his death in 1981. He had purchased the property in the 40s and through the 50s and 60s built both the home and the coach house next door. Didn't really live here full time until later in life, until he was retired. But he had been a collector beginning in the 1920s, and over his lifetime amassed some 1,000 artworks, a number of rare books which are here in the library. We have historical documents, we have silver, and a whole host of objects that he collected. Academics would refer to Sam Weir as the unruly collector for the diversity of things that he kept and that we have here on display. So we've continued that work in his legacy, bringing it up to date with contemporary art, but continuing to show the exhibitions with the permanent collection throughout the year.
One of the most important groups as the Battle of Queenston Heights was the First Nations, which was the catalyst for the Landscape of Nations Memorial that's up at Queenston Heights. So you see Brock's Monument, and just a few years ago we put up the Landscape of Nations Monument. It was done with the town of Niagara on the Lake, and it is meant to remember and to honor the First Nations groups that participated in the Battle of Queenston Heights, and very importantly were the reason why the battle was won against the Americans. It all started with Chloe Cooley's story and its story in Queenston. Now the town of Niagara on Lake has actually created a park called the Voices of Freedom Park that talks about the history of Black history in our community. And they created a walking tour app in partnership with the museum that you can download on your phone if you go to the Voices of Freedom Park website and download and do a walking tour of the town of Niagara, and it goes outside of Niagara as well, into Queenston and St. David's, and find out more about Black history as it relates to our community.
So folks, that is a wrap from the town of Queenston Heights, or should I say the historic town of Queenston. I am standing here at the final resting place of the great leader, Sir Isaac Brock. See you next time on Historical Niagara.
So about 10 years old, when you're just wandering around the neighborhood, just come across these and seen how far in they went, and kind of went home, got some rafts, come back with a couple buddies, blew up the rafts, and we kind of went in here and went back in them with the water. Went back quite a ways, maybe 100 feet or so. It gets pretty dark in there. We called them the Aborigine Caves, whether that's true or not, but that's what we used to hear. Looks like you could live in here. The only thing we've seen in here now is coyotes coming out when we come in. Okay, when you're in here, sound echoes. So I don't know if you hear, there is something in here. You always hear wild animals, could be birds, could be coyote pups, could be something, but there is sounds in here. And it kind of echoes, so it's kind of hard to tell where they're coming from or how far away they are. I just know it scares the crap out of you and you paddle like hell to get out of here when you hear them. Well, I'll tell you, I've been here at night, and I'm telling you, I wouldn't even come in this far at night. It's so spooky. You want to be spooked out of your mind, come in here at night, and you won't come in here very far because there's a lot of sounds in here at night. Lots.